All right, fully a minute past the hour, and since this is a pretty bite-sized introduction to our updated CCS methodology, I will kick off. This is being recorded and will be posted, and we'll be posting the slides as well as my contact info at the end of the presentation. So anyone who needs to chat with me about this, please reach out. Would love to discuss. But welcome and good day. Thanks for joining for this review of the updates and highlights from the ACR methodology for quantification, monitoring, reporting, and verification of greenhouse gas reductions and removals from CCS projects. And really excited for the changes that we've made and just enabling these type of projects. So I will kick it off and keep going. And so just a quick intro to us for those who are less familiar, talk about the existing methodology, the updates, and those really important key methodology elements that have been in the methodology and the expansion of methodology, and a little bit of time for questions at the end. But of course, please reach out with questions. Feel free to drop them in the chat, but also to reach out early and often after this webinar. We have extended the comment deadline to the end of November. So looking forward to hearing from folks discussing any potential questions and concerns as well. So quick intro to ACR. ACR at Windrock, we are an internationally recognized carbon registry, and we really specialize in generating high quality credits. We have numerous voluntary and independent methodologies, and these methodologies are actually also approved under the CORSIA International Aviation Compliance Program. And we are also an offset program registry under the California Compliance Program, their cap and trade program. And as the carbon markets are expanding and rapidly expanding, we are also growing at ACR, really focused on continuing to develop methodologies and programs around non-CO2 gases and our forestry programs as well, of course, CCS and deployment of CCS projects at scale. Specifically, our industrial team is expanding as well, expanding team of experts and focused on tech-based climate solutions. And so that's things like advanced refrigeration, mine methane destruction, landfill gas mitigation. And our newest methodology that's almost finished with the peer review process is orphan well plugging methodology. And so just a quick note on the methodology development process itself. We go through a pretty rigorous process right from the beginning, which starts with just the idea and that concept note review, and then the public comment process, which is where we are right now with CCS. And then after that, it goes on to scientific peer review and then publication, and it's ready for prime time and ready to be used to generate carbon credits. And the methodology goal for all methodologies, but certainly for CCS as well, is just to have these atmospheric benefits. And it really is this net benefit to the atmosphere. And I'm going to come back, even in this brief presentation, to the net benefits to the atmosphere. That's how we measure our benefits. That's how we measure what we're doing. That's how we generate credit. And of course, we want to enable projects because these benefits aren't going to happen if we're not enabling projects. And that is really for CCS, expanding opportunities into more fields and into more industries. And we've always been interested and focused on co-benefits, but we're being even more intentional and deliberate about co-benefits. That goes for local environmental benefits, and that can be around for CCS projects, specifically infrastructure build out. So CO2 pipelines or CO2 compressors, and also the just transition of the workforce and infrastructure. So we're not doing early retirement of assets necessarily, unnecessary retirement of assets, and also tracking of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and how we can really be not just focused on supporting individual projects, but how they fit into their communities as well. So at ACR, The CCS methodology was originally published in 2015. The work started in 2012, so it was a bit of a lift to get there, and it really covers just enhanced oil recovery projects, so capture, transportation, and geologic storage of anthropogenic CO2, only again through EOR. And that was updated to version 1.1 at the end of last year, and really no substantial changes were made at that point, but that was with the plan of expanding to this version 2.0 to incorporate all these additional project types, reservoirs, which broadens the methodology to different geographical locations and hopefully industries as well. So to talk about CO2 sources, we call out specifically in the updated methodology direct air capture and carbon dioxide removal. Obviously, there's increasing talk about the importance of removals, and we'll focus on that again a little bit later in the presentation, but also the opportunities within the biospace, so BECCS and bikers, and how we can leverage chlorophyll to do some of the CO2 capture heavy lifting for us. Other project types, ethanol production, point sources, industrial sources, municipal sources. There's just a lot of different places that we can get CO2 from, and we are not building any specific industries into the methodology, really looking at as many project types as we can. And for the eligible reservoirs, this is where there has been a lot of expansion from version 1.1 to version 2.0. We have included saline formations where they were not previously eligible, and also depleted oil and gas reservoirs. So those two additions really expand the geographic reach of the methodology. So there's a lot of very well characterized oil and gas reservoirs out there that are no longer in use for extracting hydrocarbons. They have some infrastructure in place, and they're very well understood, the behavior of fluids within those reservoirs, making them great candidates for CO2 sequestration. They may have a few extra holes punched in them, which will require some extra effort and monitoring. And then there's saline formations. And so there's tons and tons of these all over the place, and they're going to require that same rigorous characterization that is done in oil and gas reservoirs, but just there's so many of these out there, and really makes this broadly applicable. We do specifically call out that offshore reservoirs are eligible. I'm mostly thinking of sort of nearshore reservoirs at this point, but happy to discuss with project developers on that. And when we talk about a little bit later the requirements around reservoir rights and ownership, these offshore reservoirs have some advantages when you're unlikely to have quite as many interested parties, but you are also going to need to demonstrate the same important pore space ownership and such. We do need to show that that CO2 that's injected is going to be left there in perpetuity. And again, as I mentioned, pore space, access, and ownership requirements around the reservoirs. So for enhanced oil recovery, the existing methodology is only for EOR. And so we've introduced some additional calculations around that. And so EOR projects are basically business as usual as they are in the current methodology for the first 5 years of the project, or up until January 1st, 2030. And after that deadline, the oil that is produced will be included in the accounting in an enhanced way. And it's going to be included as process emissions. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. So this is sort of the balance that we struck around supporting the development of infrastructure, in particular pipelines, and certainly capture technology in the shorter term, but also acknowledge the importance of the sort of global transition. And this is something I know that I'm going to get a lot of comments on. I welcome the comments on this, and happy to discuss our reasoning in meetings and on a one-on-one basis. We don't have really time for it now, but it's just important that we do encourage the sort of transitional reservoirs that I've talked to lots of reservoir engineers about and oil and gas companies about, that maybe those reservoirs have been neglected as part of EOR projects to date because they just take on so much more CO2. And introducing CO2 as part of one of the financial drivers that that's how what you're monetizing by generating carbon credits or by leveraging the 45Q tax credit, you're able to transition to these reservoirs and ultimately transition to pure sequestration. And that's sort of our goal with this. So the emissions from produced oil that will be included it's somewhat of a wells to wheels accounting. And so that's going to include transportation from the refinery and then the actual refining itself. And that can be either calculated based on an average of whatever the API gravity is of the oil that's produced, or if the operator has specific knowledge of the emissions associated with refining, we can use that for both the refining and the transportation. Any transportation to distribution or wholesale terminals, and then that end use. So if, again, you are tracking your oil and you know what's happening to it, and you know it's being used as a product as opposed to just as a fuel, which is the end use for most oil that's produced, you're able to demonstrate that, or we're going to use regional averages to determine. So it's done on a regional basis because obviously that transportation and refining will vary regionally. And we also include averages for how much crude is exported from certain regions and then how much refined hydrocarbon is exported in certain regions. So that is the accounting that we will be introducing after that 5 years, or January 1st, 2030. So for some process updates around the methodology, because of just the size and scope of CCS projects, they're huge. And we need to demonstrate the financial viability of the carbon markets to support these. And so earlier within the process, projects will be able to demonstrate their eligibility. So once the FEED study, the front end engineering design, is done, that project would be able to go through the validation process and actually list on the registry to demonstrate that they are eligible, and to go out and either pre-sell credits or just demonstrate to investors that this is a revenue stream that the project will be eligible for. Once the project is built or throughout the construction process, check in with ACR and make sure that everything or any changes that are happening are keeping the project valid. But that's just sort of early warning that this project is eligible under ACR's methodology for that financial assurance. The other change is that the project proponent is allowed to define the reporting period length. That's a request I've got from quite a few project developers who don't necessarily want to do the more traditional annual reporting period. And so you would have to go through verification every time, but that also should become a more streamlined process as the project goes through its life. And then because we have so many options for sources and maybe combining forces on transportation and sequestration, we've introduced flexibility for how you would combine the sources and how you would allocate emissions and energy usage for those different sources into a single project, and how projects would be able to demonstrate what their portion of those emissions are, because we're not going to get to where we need to be with CCS without working together across industries. So quick diagram of just eligibility. And so this, again, methodology applies to CCS projects. We capture the CO2 from point sources or from carbon dioxide removal systems. We transport that CO2. I'm not going to talk too much about transportation, generally by pipeline, but other modes of transportation are also eligible. And then that geologic sequestration, sale information, depleted oil and gas reservoirs. Right. Ownership is an important piece of this. You're really going to need to demonstrate that whoever is capturing they have the title, and it is clearly defined through legal document that whoever is taking credit for the sequestration of the CO2 is legally allowed to do that, and that nobody else is legally allowed to do that. And when you have some of these blended projects where you have multiple sources coming together into a pipeline and compression system, and then ultimately into the same reservoir, divvying up the responsibilities and the rights is going to be an adventure. So we'll make sure that there's no double counting that's possible, because all those legal documents are in place. And then back to that pore space ownership. This is something that is not super clear right now in many jurisdictions. And so potentially waiting for some clarity around it from many states. But as we find that clarity, and this is something also that is going to be maybe a bit clearer in saline reservoirs, where you don't necessarily have severance of the mineral state from the surface rights. We just need to make sure that whoever is stuffing this stuff underground, that they have the right to do so, and that there's legal language that it will be there in perpetuity. And also that we are ensured surface access during the post-injection period. So after the project is done actually injecting CO2, we still require monitoring to occur. And so we need to see legal documentation that the project has access to continue and go back and monitor. This is sort of the physical or geographical boundary. I won't spend too much time on this, but we do draw the boundaries that include the first bucket here is the CO2 source, and then on to the transportation and any emissions associated with that, and then any emissions associated with the storage, including any leakage, physical leakage. This is the temporal boundary. And so the beginning of the project, even though you're able to list the project at the end of your FEED study, the project start date is really around when CO2 is first injected into the subsurface. And there are a few existing projects, obviously, out there, and the start date can be triggered in some of these existing projects by some sort of change in moving to an anthropogenic source, or installing a substantial amount of new equipment, moving into a new reservoir. So each start date is going to be pretty project specific. The crediting period is 10 years. So once you get your project approved, you have 10 years for generating credit, and you can define your own reporting period, as I said earlier. And then once that 10-year crediting period is done, you're able to renew. And there's no limit to the number of renewal periods at this time. In terms of getting at what that net benefit is to the atmosphere, we need to determine a baseline and then compare that to how much CO2 is being injected. So there's a projection-based baseline and a standards-based baseline. It's really very project-specific, and the methodology goes into this in great detail. But the takeaway message here is that we really need to know how much CO2 would have been emitted, and then how much CO2 is being sequestered, and less the process and project emission, so that we're able to determine that net benefit to the atmosphere. And to get at that, we have all of these different parameters that we're going to look at. Again, it's going to be specific to each site, but certainly measuring CO2 flows and concentration, how much fuel is being consumed, especially if it is a fossil fuel, how much electricity and steam is being used, and what's the source for that electricity and steam. If there's any equipment maintenance that is happening, or having to blow down that equipment, how much is being blown down, how often does it happen, and what's the composition of that gas, and just what's the equipment that's included within that project boundary. And then there's going to be monitoring parameters around, and that's around the source, and then there's going to be additional monitoring parameters, of course, around the subsurface once the CO2 is injected, and that's going to be addressed in the MRV plan. This is going to, of course, need to be done with appropriate equipment and equipment that is being calibrated per manufacturer specifications, and then the data collection procedures, that's all going to be detailed within the project plan to make sure that it's meeting the standards for the methodology. So jumping into the MRV plan, we need this is around the storage component, and we need this to ensure that there's no physical leakage. So once you put that CO2 in, it's not coming back out. And this is going to be incredibly site specific, of course, down to the reservoir and the infrastructure that's there. So really characterizing that reservoir. In some of these depleted oil and gas reservoirs and oil recovery reservoirs, a lot of that work is already done. If there's going to be any baseline monitoring that's required, and then throughout the project itself and the injection, we would be monitoring. And then there's that post-injection monitoring, which we have now as a minimum of 5 years. And if we can't ensure plume stabilization at the end of that 5 years, we would increase it in 2-year increments until we can demonstrate that that CO2 plume is stable, that it's behaving as was modeled in the site characterization. And note here is the MRV plan has to be developed by a subject matter expert and is potentially subject to the validation and verification sign off by either a professional geologist or a professional engineer, because these are big deal projects that happen deep underground, and so expertise needs to be demonstrated. For the quantification, getting to that net benefit for the atmosphere, there's tons of calculations in the methodology. Not everything is going to apply to every project, but we do need to make sure that the baseline emissions, project emissions, and any other emissions associated with these projects are being captured and included. And this includes emissions of CO2, potentially methane, and also nitrous oxide. And this is going to be pretty consistent with what most of these projects are already doing as part of their emissions reporting, or in the case of EOR projects, oil and gas projects, just measuring what's coming out of the reservoir and what's going into the reservoir. A really important part of any methodology is, of course, the permanence. The MRV plan addresses this, but also, the monitoring and modeling predictions need to be validated, and then any remediation that would be required should an unintentional reversal occur. And there's lots of language in the methodology around liability and how to demonstrate legally that everyone is aware, any surface owners, any mineral rights holders, that the CO2 needs to be stored within perpetuity. Again, I mentioned that's a 5-year post-injection period, and then going on and increasing every 2 years once that project, if that project is unable to demonstrate that. So we do, with the MRV, want to mitigate any unintentional reversals. And so that is what we're addressing with the MRV, of course, but also we have these mitigation accounts that, again, detailed in the methodology to make sure that we're protecting against any leakage. And then there's also the mitigation of intentional reversals. So that's where all the legal documentation on the front end comes in to make sure that all parties that could potentially have access to that CO2 in the subsurface agree that CO2 will remain undisturbed. And then looking at it broadly, just any community and environmental impacts that could potentially result from this project, and that the requirement for a plan is included in the methodology, but that is often already being completed for permitting and at the jurisdictional level. And really quick on additionality, the additional pillar for all of these methodologies. this project is considered additional, and a project is considered additional if it passes a regulatory surplus test. If it's above and beyond what is required by law, whether it's CCS specifically being required or just greenhouse gas emission reduction being required, and it also needs to exceed a performance threshold, so that can be practice-based if this is outside of business as usual, if there's not a lot of market penetration of this type of practice, or the technology is above and beyond, would be another. So with that, few minutes left for questions, and my email address is on there if anyone would like to reach out after the webinar to discuss anything that they heard here, or discuss their project in detail. And with that, I will hand it over to Brent to see if there are any questions. Left a few minutes.
Yes, thank you, Maris. In the chat, I've answered 2 of them in terms of reporting period and crediting period for renewals and duration reporting period. So for those on the call, just look at those. One question for you, Maris, that has not been addressed is, will there be, quote, will there be crediting or credits for any injection of any CH4 methane in the CO2 stream?
You know, that's not something that we really addressed in the methodology. That's a great question. And if there is any injection of methane, I would wonder, I certainly wonder what project that's happening in, but I'm happy to discuss that. It's not addressed currently, but it would probably depend on what's the intended end use for that, what was the alternative end use for that methane. So happy to discuss that more, but I don't have a complete answer for that. It's a great question.
Sure. Second is just questions about how does ACR handle deep sea carbon storage? So we're open to deep sea carbon storage. What we really need for projects like that is a robust regulatory environment and regime, because I can't be out there, or someone from ACR, as fun as it might be, can't be out there ensuring that well construction is happening appropriately, that monitoring is happening appropriately. It has to be within a broader context. So that's potentially an area for expansion, maybe version 2.1. But again, not sure who asked that question. It's a great question as well. Please reach out so we can discuss actual project opportunities, because ultimately, to, you know, from a geologic perspective, the monitoring isn't going to be looking for bubbles at the surface or too much leakage at the surface. It's really going to be about plume stabilization and behavior of the plume in the subsurface, which you can monitor just as well. And if it's a marine sequestration, but it does get complicated, as we know. The deeper you get and the further you get from the shore. So happy to discuss. Great question. I think this might round us up for the bottom of the hour here at 12:30 Eastern time, was if a potential project developer is interested in earning credits based on this methodology, how would said developer go about it using ACR's registry? At a high level, what would be some of those steps there, Maris?
Oh my goodness, in 30 seconds. Call me. Let's discuss. There's, you know, it's going to be project specific somewhat, but certainly getting an account with ACR and kicking off that journey with our outstanding registry operations team, and then talking project specifics and how to do all the MRV and what the net benefit to the atmosphere is. That's a big question and could spend a long time on it, but we're here to have the discussion and here to help. And I think that does take us, as Brent said, to time. Again, just want to again and again say, please reach out. I'm happy to discuss project specifics or methodology development, any topic, and do please feel free to submit comments or reach out to me before the comment deadline to discuss your comments. Really these methodologies benefit so much from public engagement because ultimately project developers are the ones that we need to be interacting with, interfacing with, and we want to make sure that the methodology is both robust but also user friendly. So with that, I will say thank you to everyone and have a great day.